older I've got, the more I discover that there are things that irritate me. I just happened to look at my wife. It was incidental. But one of the things that really gets me going is getting to September and these shops start putting up Christmas decorations all over the place. I find myself being irritated, and I don't want to go shopping. But I do succumb and I go anyway. And it's tragic that we have somehow managed to take what I regard as the most significant event in our Christian calendar, the most significant commemoration that we have, and we've commercialized it as we have, so that it almost comes to mean nothing, or we make it childish, not childlike, we make it childish, so that we can sort of say, oh, well, the kids like this. And yet this event is what makes our Christian faith radically different from any other event, any other religion. Because Christmas it's called the Advent in theological, liturgical circles. Advent, the coming of Jesus, the coming of God as He breaks into our world in order to establish His kingdom, establishing His kingdom through His people. That's what the Advent is about. That's what Christmas is really all about. And I know you can't sort of say, well, Christmas is more important than Easter, or more important than Pentecost. I know those things are all important. But if God hadn't chosen to break in, and for us to remember that He's chosen to break in, we would have no message. Have no message at all. And so Christianity is set apart from other religions by God choosing to come to earth, God choosing to become a human being here on planet Earth and live a perfect life here. And that's what we remember. That's the Advent. The word Advent, scholars use it to refer to three Advents. The Advent that we remember of 2,000 years ago, the coming 2,000 years ago, but also the coming that is still to come, Jesus' second coming, believing that He will come back again. But then also, He's coming into our hearts individually, into our beings, as we invite Him in. And so Advent is hugely important. And we mustn't just think in terms of the baby coming back to earth. There's so much more than that. As the Nicene Creed says, for us men and for our salvation, He came down from heaven, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, He was incarnate of the Virgin Mary and became man. That's the first Advent. That's what we're remembering. But the very creed goes on and says, and He will come again to judge both the living and the dead, and His kingdom will have no end. And that is a second coming that is still to come. His kingdom will have no end. Over the coming weeks, I've chosen to preach on events around the first Advent, around Christmas. Passages that are very rarely preached on. And I'm starting that this morning as we look at Zechariah and the angel appearing to Zechariah and the birth of John the Baptist. Now it's only in two of our Gospels, Matthew and Luke, that we know anything about the events surrounding Jesus coming to earth. And the most detailed account is given to us by Luke. Luke, who was not a follower of Jesus, he probably never met Jesus when Jesus was on earth. He was a Gentile, a non-Jew, who converted, and he was already a doctor, a medical doctor. And he became a friend and supporter of the Apostle Paul during his missionary journeys. And this morning I want to preach on a very seldom preached on passage, if ever you would have heard it, a message on this, on Zechariah having an encounter with the angel in the temple. Zechariah was the father of John the Baptist, the man who became John the Baptist. Not like the Baptist Union of South Africa, but John the Baptizer is a better way to put it. And it's the first incident in our Christmas story. So from Luke chapter 1, we read this. And by the way, you might end up saying, how did Luke know all this stuff? Well, he must have interviewed. He says in verses 1 to 3, he says that he went and he did research. So our Gospel of Luke is actually a research document that Luke did in order to discover what really happened, because there was a lot of other stories, written notes going around at the time. And he says to this person that he's writing it for, Theophilus, and he says, I wanted you to know the truth of what really happened. And so he must have got an interview. That's how he would have known what happened to Zechariah and Elizabeth, because he must have interviewed them. That's how he knows what happened to Mary, because he must have asked her what happened. And so in chapter 1 and verse 5, we read this. In the time of Herod, the king of Judea, this is Herod the Great, Herod the one who built the temple that there was during Jesus' time. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. The priestly division of Abijah. All of Aaron was Moses' brother. You'll remember that. And Aaron's family, Aaron's tribe ultimately became the people who would work in the temple, the priests and the Levites. They were Aaron's family. And during the time of King David, David organized them in such a way so that they formed different units, and they served in the temple at different stages, because there was already then too many of them to serve all at once. And both Elizabeth and Zechariah were descendants of Aaron. His wife, Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah, his wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. So they both had priestly lines down to them. Both of them were upright in the sight of God. It wasn't just their natural heritage that was important to them. They were upright in the sight of God. They lived good, godly lives, observing all the Lord's commandments and regulations blamelessly. Is that not a wonderful attribute? To be able to say that they lived lives that were blameless before God. But they had no children, because Elizabeth was barren. And they were both well along in years. I love that phrase. They were both well along in years. Having no children was a great heartache, much more so than even today when families and couples have longed to have children and find they can't. In those days it was a great shame to not have children. It was regarded, people would whisper behind their hand, I wonder what she's done that she can't have children. It's interesting that the rabbis said that there were 7 people who were excommunicated from God. The list began with this: a Jew who has no wife, or a Jew who has a wife and has no child. I mean, that's the kind of feeling that there was related to Elizabeth being barren. Don't just skip over that word. This was a huge trauma, a huge heartache, a huge stigma in their lives, a stigma in the community, because what have they done wrong that they've got no children? Once, when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as a priest before God, now what happened is Zechariah's unit, they'd be divided into different units, categories, and then they would serve for a week at a time. And once, when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as the priest before God, he was chosen by lot. There were still too many of them to actually be able to serve in the building, the temple itself. And so they were chosen by lot for this great privilege of being able to go into the temple itself and to replace the incense and the bread of offering and that kind of thing. Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God. He was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. That was a very special blessing. And when the time came for the burning of incense, all the assembled worshippers were praying outside. Sacrifices were offered morning and evening, and he was chosen to go right into the temple. a very special honor. Verse 11. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. An angel appeared to him. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled. Don't you look startled? When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. This was not an everyday event, and this was something hugely significant. And he was afraid, wondering what was going on here. I guess it's a little bit like the custodians coming into the church building on a Sunday morning and wanting to open up and suddenly finding an angel standing here. When last did that happen to him? But that's what happened here. And he saw this angel. And not only that, the angel interacted with him. The angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah." First, puts him at peace. Your prayer has been heard. The prayer? For a child. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to give him the name John. They were well on in years, remember? Okay, they were probably 35. They were well on in years. And the angel says, your prayer has been answered. And this is the first time that a message from God has come through to the people for 400 years. 400 years. And what's he doing? He's speaking to a priest and telling him that he's going to be blessed by having a son, by having a child. Even though he and Elizabeth have been barren for a number of years. And then the angel continues and says, he, that is the baby, he will be, first he's identifying it as being a boy. Now that's a good thing. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. People are going to be excited about this birth. They're going to understand that despite the heartache that Elizabeth and Zechariah have been through, despite that heartache, here God is now blessing them, and they will celebrate and rejoice with them. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we heard an angel say that to us about our children when they were born? He will be great in the sight of the Lord. But he's never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even from birth. It's not to take wine, he's to live as a Nazarite. Nazarites made, there were certain commitments that either their parents made or they made. They never cut their hair. So Samson was a Nazarite. Samuel was a Nazarite. Paul took a Nazarite vow when he went into Jerusalem. And they never cut their hair. They wouldn't touch alcohol, and they wouldn't touch dead bodies either. And this baby, says the angel, this baby is going to be unique from all over the earth. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit from birth. And many of the people of Israel will he bring back to the Lord their God. And he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. The people were expecting that Elijah would come back and prepare the way for the Messiah when he comes. And he says here, this baby of yours is going to go on and prepare the way for the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of their fathers to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. He's going to prepare the people to receive this Lord who is breaking in. He's going to break in. Zechariah asked the angel, how can I be sure of this? I'm an old man, and my wife is well along in years. He's really saying, I'm not so sure I can believe you. It's quite something. It's not possible, he's saying. The angel answered, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their proper time. think it's a little bit tough on Zechariah, isn't it? But the Lord sort of reprimands him. You're not going to be able to speak, Zechariah. You're not going to be able to tell people about what happened. God puts Zechariah on mute, silences him. Can you imagine the hardship? I don't think we can. I pondered this at least all week again. And the heartache of not being able to have children, and the heartache of not being able to tell people about this encounter you had with God. You may need to ask if God is not using some hardship in your life to want to use that opportunity to speak to you and do something special through you. What is it that's hard in your family? What is it that's hard in your neighborhood? What is it that's really tough and causing hardship and heartache for you? And when I say in the mornings, time and again, pray for yourself, pray for your loved ones, this is the sort of thing I'm talking about. Bring these things before God and maybe see if He doesn't speak to you. And meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. They realized that he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. I can't imagine what signs do you make to say, I saw an angel? I don't know how that works. But they understood him. The people were wondering. They realized that he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. And when his time of service was completed, he returned home. And after this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and for 5 months remained in seclusion. You understand the seclusion bit, don't you? That she understands what it is, both in the community and maybe even for herself, to lose a baby. To start off being so excited, and then the baby's lost. And she didn't want this to happen, and so she secludes herself for 5 months. The Lord has done this for me, she said, and in these days He has shown His favor and taken away my disgrace among the people. Oh, isn't that great? Isn't that lovely? She's able to say, God has done this for me. He's taken away my disgrace. And maybe it's only those of you who have struggled to have a family who will really understand something of what they went through. But it was huge. And then Luke goes on and he talks about angels speaking to Mary, etc. But then in verse 57 he says this: when it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. The prophecy, the prediction was fulfilled, and they shared her joy. Oh, how we need to learn to be able to share joyful events with one another. Instead of just wondering what you're going to take to the baby shower, to be able to just celebrate the fact that the baby's been born. And the child grew and became strong in spirit. And he lived in the desert until he appeared publicly to Israel. There are a couple of lovely scenes in this series, The Chosen. I'm sure most of you would have seen the series, The Chosen. And whenever Peter speaks about John the Baptizer, he calls him Creepy John. I love that phrase. And the child grew and became strong, and he lived in the desert until he appeared publicly to Israel. And this was how 400 years of silence from God, silence, ended. So here, what are we to take away from this? Hardship does not mean that you're out of God's will for your life. Going through heartache, struggle, does not mean that you're out of God's will. Many of you have longed to experience God speak, God to communicate with you. I try to emphasize some of that. this morning, asking God to speak to you. I ask it week by week that God would speak to you. Not because of a sermon, but because of His Spirit speaking to you. And hardship is something that's part of the Christian walk as much as it is for anybody else. There were times in my history, I remember a couple of decades ago, when the talk amongst the so-called faith churches was that if you're struggling or there's anything that's difficult in your life, it's because of sin in your life. And it may not be. It may not be. It may not be. It happened to Paul and Silas. It happened to Zechariah and Elizabeth. Paul and Silas. I love this chapter 16 of the book of Acts, and I'm going to read it to you very, very quickly, run through this here. Paul was on his second missionary journey, and he started off in Antioch, which is in Syria. You're folk all familiar with the map of that, Syria right now. And he walked through Turkey, all right, sharing the gospel as he went. He had a plan in mind. Next, Paul and Silas traveled through the area of Phrygia and Galatia. You can put that up, Ian, and I'll just read it as we go. Traveled through the area of Phrygia and Galatia because the Holy Spirit had prevented them from preaching the word in the province of Asia at that time. Just click on that, Ian. The next one. There you go. All right. Yeah, they traveled through Phrygia and Galatia. You can see where that is. Because the Holy Spirit had prevented them. The next one. Had prevented them from... That was the Roman province of Asia. And somehow, we don't know how the Holy Spirit prevented them. Maybe they were warned that there were robbers on the route. Or maybe there was some sort of military action taking place. But the Holy Spirit prevented them from going to Asia. Even though this had been their plan. They must have thought, this is what God wants us to do. But the Holy Spirit prevented them, probably circumstantially. Then, coming to the borders of Mysia, they headed north for the province of Bithynia. Go to the next one, Ian. Good. And you have to go through that all again. Phrygia and Galatia, not into Asia, so they headed north, up to Mysia. But again, the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them to go there. So instead, they went on through Mysia to the seaport of Troas. Oh, by going to Mysia, they were trying to get to Bithynia. Put up Bithynia, yeah? They were trying to get to Bithynia, but they also couldn't go there. So instead, they went on through Mysia to the seaport of Troas. Next one. They went through Mysia and ended up at the seaport of Troas. Now, this is not just a geography/history lesson. What I'm wanting to point out to you is they had things that they had in mind, and they must have been passionate about what they were doing, and yet it didn't work out. It didn't work out. That night in Troas, that night Paul had a vision. A man from Macedonia in northern Greece. You can put that map up as well, Ian, with all the arrows and everything else in it. That night, Paul had a vision of a man from Macedonia in northern Greece standing there, pleading with him, come over to Macedonia and help us. So we decided to leave for Macedonia at once, having concluded that God was calling us to preach the good news there. They had these expectations of going into Asia, going into Bithynia, maybe Mysia, but no, they end up in Troas. Why? Now we've reached the end of we've reached the coast. What do we do now? And then God says, come over to Macedonia. And they go to Macedonia and they end up in the town of Philippi. And you can read all about this. And it's wonderful. They have a great time. They lead Lydia to the Lord, her and her family, and they were all baptized. But then, because they cast out a demon out of a slave girl, and the owners get hold of Paul and Silas, they get them taken to court. The punishment is that they get beaten and they get thrown into prison. And they're in the deepest prison and they're facing, hardship. We have no idea about hardship of being beaten because we're Christians. We have no idea at all. They could have ended up saying, is this really, is God in all of this? Really? But no, they end up singing praises to God at midnight. And then there's the earthquake. And then the Roman jailer commits to, and his family commit to the Lord as well. And because of what they did, they went across to Macedonia. You and I are sitting here today. Because that's what got the gospel out of Asia, what we call Asia Minor, into Europe. And 2,000 years later, it's reached us. I just want to say this because, you see, it's not going through hardship, facing disappointment, whether it be Zechariah and Elizabeth, or whether it be Paul and Silas, or whether it be Ken and Val, or anybody else. Hardship does not mean that God has abandoned you. That great promise in Romans chapter 8, in which he said, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. And sometimes we're going to end up saying, I can't see God's hand in this. How could this possibly be? But he promises that it is. So I bring this to a close, just to wrap up here and say this. God speaks most faithfully. God speaks most clearly, I beg your pardon. God speaks most clearly when we are faithfully doing what God has called us to do. And you are most likely to have an encounter with God as you faithfully do the work of God among the people of God. It's important to faithfully worship him. And you might have been sitting here, you know what, I go to church Sunday by Sunday and I wonder if it's all worthwhile. Yes, it is. It is. Because we need you. You are part of the body. If you're not here, the body is not complete. So when you're struggling spiritually, please don't withdraw. And as we reach the end of the year, I was saying to the staff the other day that as we reach, you'll find that October, November is the time when everybody resigns from different positions in church work. Sunday school teachers suddenly saying, I'm facing next year, I'll give you till the end of this year, but I can't go on beyond that. Cell group leaders do the same thing. People who are involved end up saying, I can't do this anymore. But it's when you're faithfully doing what God has actually called you to do that you're most likely to hear him speak to you. And that includes being part of the church. Because you are the body of Christ. And each one of you is part of it. That's 1 Corinthians. It should be there. Yeah? You are the body of Christ. You are. And each one of you is a part of it. And you have a role to play in the body. And you will never know the kind of miracle that God might work through you because you faithfully do what he called you to do. It might seem that you're getting nowhere. But as you faithfully do what he's called you to do, you'll be amazed at what he can work through you. Paul had no idea how his letters would affect the history of our planet. Luke had no idea about when he wrote his research document, how it would affect the life of millions of people over the centuries. The prophets had no idea. And you never know when your step of obedience is going to have an effect that goes way beyond yourself. As you continue faithfully, wait for God. Anticipate God speaking to you, enabling you, because that's what he does. Have you been tempted to want to give up? I don't want to do this anymore. I've done it and it just seems like it's the same old, same old. Is that what's happening inside of you? But if God's word to you today is to say, don't give up. Don't give up. Maybe you're afraid. Maybe you're discouraged. Wondering if you've got the resources to see it through to the end. You have. Because greater is he who is in you and he who is in the world. And you will discover the resources as you step out in faith. You know, a rocket might have tons and tons of power in order to get it up into space, but it's only as it moves that they can start guiding it. And it's only as you move that God can guide you into what he wants you to do. This morning may well be a moment of recommitment for you. In fact, I want to ask you, have you not got to recommit yourself to some kind of service before God here this morning? no matter the hardship, no matter that it costs. It usually does cost. And I don't just mean financially. The God who loves you, the God who loves you says, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. What's the Lord saying to you?